For 7 nights, the shadow child had followed Salvatore to his gates, always stopping where the light ended. Salvatore never looked back. In his world, an abandoned child was a distraction he couldn't afford. But as the iron gates began to hiss shut, the routine shattered. Naomi Holloway, the estate's youngest maid, broke the house's primary rule. She grabbed Salvatore's tailored sleeve. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the security monitors. "He isn't just following you, Don Salvatore," she whispered, her grip tightening on his arm. "Look at the marks on his neck. Look at the way he flinches when the wind howls. He isn't following a monster. He's running from one. And he thinks you're the only thing big enough to hide behind." Salvatore looked at the screen, his cold eyes narrowing as he finally saw the bruises hidden by the boy's collar. He asked Naomi one question. When she whispered the name of the man the boy was fleeing, a name belonging to a rival Salvatore thought he had buried years ago, the silk finally snapped. Salvatore didn't head for the safety of his mansion. He slowly put out his cigar, pulled a heavy chrome .45 from his holster, and turned back toward the dark street. The devil of New York was no longer going home. He was going to war. The iron gates had barely locked when the high-pitched wail of a police siren cut through the rain, followed by the blinding flash of red and blue strobes reflecting off the wet pavement. A black and white cruiser screeched to a halt just inches from the perimeter. Matteo Thorne stepped out of the car, his detective's badge pinned to his belt, gleaming with a false sense of righteousness. He didn't look like a grieving father. He looked like a predator who had been denied his kill. He marched toward the gate, his hand resting on the hilt of his service weapon. "Moretti!" Thorne barked, his voice cracking with a mixture of adrenaline and rage. "I know you have the boy. That's my son. Open this gate right now or I'm coming in with a warrant and enough backup to level this fortress." Salvatore didn't move. He stood on the other side of the wrought iron, the rain slicking his dark hair back, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. Behind him, Naomi stood in the foyer, her hand clutching Elio's shoulder. The boy had buried his face in her uniform, his small body vibrating with a terror so profound it seemed to radiate through the glass. "You're trespassing, detective," Salvatore said, his voice a low melodic silk that carried effortlessly over the storm. "And you're mistaken. There is no son of yours here. Only a boy who belongs to the city now." "Don't play games with me," Thorne spat, reaching through the bars to grab at Salvatore's lapel. "I am the law in this precinct. You're just a dinosaur in a suit. Give me the kid, or I'll spend the rest of my career making sure you rot in a cage." In a move so fast it was almost invisible, Salvatore's hand shot out. He didn't reach for his gun. He grabbed Thorne's reaching wrist with a grip that had crushed the spirits of men far more powerful than a corrupt detective. With a precise, sickening crack, Salvatore twisted. Thorne let out a strangled scream, his knees buckling as he hit the wet asphalt. His badge pressed into the dirt. Salvatore leaned down, his face inches from the bars, his eyes glowing with a predatory light. "The law stops at my property line, Matteo. Out here, you're just a man with a broken wrist and a very short future. If you touch my gate again, I won't just break your bones. I'll erase the memory of you." He let go, and Thorne slumped back, cradling his shattered arm. Salvatore turned his back on the sirens and the screaming man, walking back toward the house. He didn't look at the detective. He looked at Elio, who was watching from the window, and for the first time, the boy didn't look like he wanted to run. The sky over the estate finally surrendered, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the gravel driveway into a rushing stream. From the safety of the limestone foyer, Naomi watched the gate through the sidelight windows. The boy, Elio, hadn't moved. He stood hunched against the iron bars, his thin worn clothes plastered to his skin, shivering so violently that she could hear his teeth chattering even over the thunder. "Sir, he's freezing," Naomi said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. Salvatore sat in a high-backed leather chair in the adjacent study, the smoke from his cigar curling toward the ceiling like a ghost. He didn't look up from the ledger on his lap. "The world is a cold place, Naomi. He's safer out there in the rain than he is inside these walls. My house is a target, not a nursery." "He's a child," she snapped, the sudden sharpness of her tone making the guards by the door shift their weight. "He's been out there for 7 nights. If the rain doesn't kill him, whatever is chasing him will." Salvatore remained silent, a statue of scarred perfection. Naomi didn't wait for the permission she knew wasn't coming. She spun on her heel, threw back the heavy brass bolts of the front door, and ran into the storm. The wind whipped her apron as she reached the gate, her fingers fumbling with the manual release. She grabbed the boy by his small bony shoulders. He didn't fight her. He was too weak to resist. She scooped him into her arms, he weighed almost nothing, and sprinted back toward the amber glow of the mansion. When she stepped back into the foyer, dripping wet and gasping for air, the house was deathly quiet. Salvatore stood in the doorway of the study, his silhouette tall and imposing against the library lights. "You were given a direct order," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. Naomi ignored the threat, kneeling on the marble floor to wrap Elio in a dry velvet throw she'd pulled from a nearby bench. The boy looked up, his wide, haunted eyes darting from Naomi to the towering man in the sharp suit. He looked like a wounded bird in the presence of a hawk. Salvatore walked forward, his handmade shoes clicking rhythmically on the stone. He stopped inches from them, looking down at the waif who had breached his sanctuary. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain drumming against the roof. Elio reached out a small, trembling hand. He didn't grab Salvatore's hand. He reached for the hem of his dark jacket, gripping the expensive fabric with mud-stained fingers. "He's here," the boy whispered, his first words a raspy plea. Salvatore looked at the small hand on his suit, then at the raw purple bruises circling the boy's throat. The cold, watchful light in his eyes shifted, darkening into something primal. He didn't push the child away. Instead, he looked at Naomi, his jaw set in a hard, lethal line. "Take him to the kitchen," Salvatore commanded. "Feed him. And find out exactly who put their hands on him. I need to know whose life I'm ending tonight." The kitchen was a cavern of stainless steel and shadows, warmed only by the low hum of the industrial refrigerators and the steam rising from a bowl of broth Naomi had placed before the boy. Elio didn't eat. He sat on the edge of an oversized wooden stool, his small hands buried in the thick velvet throw, staring at the doorway where Salvatore stood. The Mafia boss had shed his suit jacket, rolling his white sleeves up to reveal forearms mapped with old scars and a heavy gold watch that caught the dim light. He approached the butcher block island, not with the predatory grace of a killer, but with a calculated, heavy stillness. He placed his hand-carved mahogany cigar box on the table between them. "Naomi says you won't speak," Salvatore said, his voice like the low vibration of a cello. "In my world, silence is a virtue. But tonight, it's a wall I need to climb." Elio looked at the box, then up at Salvatore. His eyes were wide, reflecting a wisdom no 4-year-old should possess, the hollow look of someone who had seen the earth open up and swallow his life. Slowly, the boy reached out and touched the lid of the box. "Go ahead," Salvatore murmured. Elio opened the box. Instead of taking a cigar, he began to move them. He took 3 long cohibas and stood them upright on the wooden surface, forming a small semicircle. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, crushed chess piece, a white knight Naomi had given him earlier. He placed the knight in the center of the cigars. With trembling fingers, Elio pointed to the 3 cigars. "Bad men," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. Then he reached for a 4th cigar, a distinct, darker Maduro that sat apart from the others. He placed it directly behind the white knight, then tipped the knight over, letting it clatter against the wood. Finally, he moved the dark cigar until it was touching the 3 bad men. Salvatore's eyes went cold. The Maduro was a specific brand, a gift he gave only to his inner circle. He looked at the arrangement, the 3 rivals and the 1 man inside his house who had cleared the path for the night to fall. "The man with the dark smoke," Salvatore said, his jaw tightening until the bones stood out. "Who was he, Elio?" The boy didn't speak. Instead, he mimicked a gesture, a specific, rhythmic tapping of a ring against a table. It was a nervous habit Salvatore had seen 1,000 times during Sunday dinners. It was the signature of Vincent, his right-hand man and the person he trusted with his life. Salvatore closed the cigar box with a soft, final thud. The betrayal tasted more bitter than the tobacco. He looked at the boy who was now shaking, the weight of the secret finally off his shoulders. "Naomi," Salvatore called out without looking away from the child. "Take him upstairs to the guest wing. Lock the door. And tell the guards at the landing that if anyone but me tries to enter that hallway, they aren't to ask for a name. They are to open fire." He reached out,
his large scarred hand hovering over Elio's head for a second before he gently rested it on the boy's hair.
You did well, little ghost. The man who hurt you. He doesn't know it yet, but he's already dead. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 2 in the morning, the heavy chimes vibrating through the floorboards like a funeral march.
Salvatore sat in the dim glow of his private study, the only light coming from the blue-white glare of a laptop screen and the dying embers of his cigar.
On the desk lay the crushed white knight Elio had used to tell his story, a plastic relic of a fallen kingdom. Salvatore's fingers flew across the keys, bypassing layers of encrypted databases that the rest of the world didn't know existed. He wasn't looking for a living child. He was looking for a dead family. He scrolled through police reports from 3 years prior, a gas leak explosion in a Staten Island villa that had leveled an entire estate. The headlines had called it a tragedy. The underworld knew it as the Valenti Purge. The Valenti Syndicate had been Salvatore's fiercest rivals, a bloodline of proud, stubborn men who refused to bow to the Moretti expansion. When their villa burned, the record stated there were no survivors. The Don, his wife, and their infant son had been declared ash. Salvatore paused, his breath catching in his throat as he pulled up a grainy, unreleased crime scene photo from a neighbor's security feed.
It showed a figure in a dark uniform, a man Salvatore now recognized as Vincent, carrying a small, bundled shape away from the flames before the sirens arrived.
They didn't kill him, Salvatore whispered to the empty room. They kept him as leverage. A ghost in a cage. He cross-referenced the Valenti genealogy. Elio wasn't just a witness. He was the last of the Valenti line. His very existence was a hand grenade under the foundation of the city's power structure. If the other families found out the Morettis were harboring a Valenti heir, it wouldn't just be a coup, it would be a holy war. A soft creak at the door made Salvatore close the laptop instantly. Naomi stood there, her uniform replaced by a dark sweater, her expression weary but resolute. He's finally asleep, she said softly. But he holds his breath in his dreams, Salvatore. He's waiting for the floor to give way. Salvatore looked at the white knight on his desk. He had spent his life systematically removing every obstacle to his throne, yet here was the son of his greatest enemy, sleeping under his roof. By the laws of the Mafia, he should hand the boy over or finish what the fire started. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long jagged shadow across the room. He reached out and picked up the chess piece, crushing it in his palm until the plastic snapped. He isn't a Valenti anymore, Naomi, Salvatore said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal pitch. The Valentis died in that fire. This boy is a Moretti now.
And I am going to burn every man who remembers otherwise.
The following morning, the estate felt less like a fortress and more like a classroom. The rain had ceased, leaving the gardens draped in a heavy silver mist. Salvatore stood on the wide stone terrace, his hands clasped behind his back, watching Elio. The boy was sitting on a marble bench, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on his own tattered shoes as if trying to disappear into the masonry. Salvatore approached, his shadow falling over the boy like a protective cloak. He didn't reach down to comfort him. Instead, he tapped the toe of his polished Oxford against Elio's shoe. "Look up," Salvatore commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor. "In this house, we do not look at the dirt. The dirt is for those we have already stepped over." Elio tilted his head back, squinting against the morning light. "Your chin," Salvatore said, adjusting the boy's posture with a single firm finger under his jaw. "Keep it level. If you show your throat to the world, someone will eventually try to cut it. You are a Moretti now. That means you own the air you breathe. Do you understand?" Elio swallowed hard, his small chest expanding as he tried to mimic the Don's rigid spine. He nodded, a tiny flicker of defiance finally sparking in his dark eyes. From the doorway, Naomi watched the exchange, a tray of tea in her hands. She waited until Salvatore stepped away before she approached. She didn't talk about power or throats. Instead, she sat on the bench and pulled a small, wooden comb from her pocket. "He isn't a soldier yet, Salvatore," she said softly, her eyes meeting the boss's cold gaze. "He's a boy who hasn't had a warm meal or a gentle word in years." Salvatore watched with an unreadable expression as Naomi began to carefully work the tangles out of Elio's hair. She spoke to the child in low, melodic tones, telling him about the birds in the garden and the honey she'd put in his porridge. Under her touch, the tension that Salvatore's lessons had built began to melt. Elio leaned into her, his eyes closing.
his small hand reaching out to find the hem of her apron.
"This is a waste of time," Salvatore muttered, though he didn't turn away. "Gentleness doesn't win wars."
"No," Naomi countered, looking up at him with a fearless clarity.
"But it gives a man something worth fighting for. You've spent your life collecting territories and debts, but you've never owned a single heart.
If you want this boy to be loyal to you, you have to give him a reason to love you, not just fear the people you kill."
Salvatore looked at the boy, now resting his head in Naomi's lap, and then at his own scarred palms. For the first time in his life, he realized that his empire was a hollow shell.
He stood there for a long time, caught between the man he was and the guardian he was becoming, learning the hardest lesson of all, that true power wasn't just in the hand that held the gun, but in the hand that refused to let go.
The shadows in the mansion grew long as a sudden unnatural stillness settled over the estate. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, but the pressurized silence of a trap being set. Salvatore stood in the center of the dark gallery, his senses screaming. He looked up at the corner of the ceiling. The small green heartbeat of the security camera had gone dark. One by one, the red status lights on the electronic locks flickered from lock to open with a series of muffled mechanical clicks. "The perimeter is down," Salvatore whispered to the empty hallway. He didn't need a radio to know his guards weren't responding. The silk that protected him, the invisible web of loyalty and technology, had been cut from the inside. A heavy thud echoed from the basement level, followed by the unmistakable sound of the service entrance swinging wide. Salvatore felt the cold draft of the night air rushing into the climate-controlled house. He pulled his chrome .45 from his waistband, the weight of the steel familiar and grounding. He didn't head for the panic room. He headed for the stairs. "Vincent," Salvatore breathed, the name a curse. At the top of the landing, he nearly collided with Naomi, who was clutching a wide-eyed Elio to her chest. Her face was a mask of terror, but her grip on the boy was like iron. "The lights went out in the nursery," she hissed, her voice low and frantic. "The elevators aren't moving, and I heard boots on the back stairs. Salvatore, they're inside." Salvatore grabbed Naomi by the shoulder, shoving her toward a hidden seam in the oak paneling of the hallway. "Get in the crawl space. Don't make a sound, even if you hear me fall. If the door opens and it isn't me, you use the service slide to the cellar and don't stop running until you hit the river." "What about you?" she whispered, her eyes searching his. Salvatore didn't answer. He heard the heavy rhythmic tread of tactical boots on the marble below. Too many for a simple arrest, too synchronized for anything but a hit. The front doors, the ones he had built to withstand a siege, groaned as they were opened by a key that only his inner circle possessed. He stepped into the center of the grand staircase, illuminated only by the moonlight spilling through the high windows. Below him, a dozen men in black tactical gear poured into his foyer, their rifle suppressors glinting. At the head of the formation stood Vincent, tapping his ring against the barrel of his carbine, the same rhythmic tapping Elio had mimicked with the cigars. "Salvatore." Vincent's voice echoed, devoid of the respect it had carried for a decade. "The boy is a ghost, and ghosts belong in the ground. Give him up, and maybe I'll let you die with your suit on." Salvatore stood his ground, a lone silhouette against the darkness of his own crumbling empire. He realized then that the silk hadn't just been frayed. It had been a shroud he'd been weaving for himself for years. He raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You entered my house without an invitation, Vincent. That's a mistake you won't live to regret." The first shot didn't come from a rifle, but from the shadow of the grand staircase as Salvatore's chrome .45 barked a rhythmic lethal greeting. The library doors groaned under the weight of tactical boots, and suddenly the sanctuary of leather-bound books and mahogany was transformed into a kill zone. Glass from the high display cases shattered like falling diamonds, raining down on the Persian rugs as the heavy thud of suppressed fire chewed through the insulation of the walls. "Down! Behind the desk!" Salvatore roared, his voice cutting through the chaos of whistling lead and splintering wood. Naomi didn't hesitate. She dove behind the massive, iron-reinforced oak desk, pulling Elio into the knee-hole. The boy was eerily silent, his small fingers dug into the fabric of Naomi's sweater, his eyes reflecting the strobing muzzle flashes like a trapped animal watching a forest fire. Salvatore stood as a sentinel in the center of the room. He moved with a cold, mechanical precision, returning fire to keep the mercenaries pinned in the hallway. He wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting for seconds. Every breath he took was a wall he built between the gunman and the child. "Vincent, come and take it."
Salvatore challenged. His voice a low, mocking velvet that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. A mercenary leaped through the shattered French doors, his rifle leveled at the gap beneath the desk where Elio's small, muddied shoe was visible.
The world seemed to slow to a crawl. Salvatore saw the barrel pivot, saw the mercenary's finger tighten, and he knew his own weapon was empty. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the cost. The man who had spent a lifetime avoiding weakness threw himself into the line of fire. The impact was a dull, hot sledgehammer to his shoulder.
The force spun Salvatore around, his blood spraying across the white pages of an open book on the desk.
He hit the floor hard, his breath leaving him in a ragged gasp, but he didn't stay down.
Gritting his teeth against the white-hot agony, he drew a backup piece from his ankle holster and fired a single perfect shot that dropped the gunman in the doorway.
"Salvatore!" Naomi screamed, reaching out to grab his hand. He slumped against the side of the desk, his white shirt rapidly turning a deep, visceral crimson.
He looked down at Elio, who was staring at the red stain on Salvatore's chest with wide, trembling eyes.
For the first time, the boy reached out and touched Salvatore's face, his small hand steadying the Don's flickering consciousness. "I'm still here," Salvatore wheezed, a ghost of a smile touching his bloodless lips.
He felt the weight of the bullet in his flesh and the weight of the boy's hand on his cheek.
One was a death sentence. The other was a reason to live. The sound of boots grew louder.
The main force was closing in, and Salvatore was running out of blood, but as he looked at the ghost of the Valentes, he knew the hitmen would have to walk over his corpse to reach the boy.
And Salvatore Moretti was not ready to be a corpse just yet.
The library was a haze of drywall dust and the bitter scent of spent gunpowder. Salvatore lay slumped against the desk, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. His hand still clamped over the blooming red stain on his shoulder.
10 feet away, the heavy oak doors groaned as a shadow loomed in the threshold.
It wasn't the tactical precision of a mercenary. It was the slow, arrogant stride of a man who thought he had already won.
Vincent stepped into the room, his silencer-equipped pistol leveled at Salvatore's head.
"All that power, Silk," Vincent sneered, his ring tapping a rhythmic death knell against the metal of his gun.
"And you traded all for a ghost child and a maid." From beneath the desk, Naomi saw the shadow move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was as cold as the marble floor. She didn't have a gun, and she didn't have Salvatore's strength, but she knew this house better than the men who were currently bleeding in its hallways. As Vincent stepped past a tall rolling library ladder to reach the desk, Naomi acted. She reached out and kicked the brass locking mechanism of the heavy ladder with everything she had, then shoved a massive leather-bound encyclopedia into the path of the wheels. The ladder didn't just move. It swiveled and collapsed with the weight of a falling tree. Vincent instinctively ducked, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. That second was all Salvatore needed.
With a roar of primal defiance, Salvatore lunged from the floor. He didn't fire his weapon. He tackled Vincent, the momentum carrying them both into the center of the room.
They crashed into a display table, glass shattering around them like frozen rain.
Despite the hole in his shoulder, Salvatore's grip was absolute.
He pinned Vincent's wrist to the floor, the bone snapping with a sickening pop that mirrored the detective's fate at the gate.
"You called me a dinosaur, Vincent," Salvatore whispered, his voice a silk-smooth rasp inches from the traitor's ear.
"You forgot that dinosaurs were the greatest predators this world ever saw." Salvatore didn't use a bullet. That would have been too quick, too merciful for a man who had threatened a child.
He reached for the heavy glass shard of the broken display case, the one that had held the Valenti history, and pressed it to Vincent's throat.
"For the boy," Salvatore said. One swift, surgical motion later, the tapping of the ring stopped forever. Salvatore rolled off the body, gasping as the adrenaline began to fade.
He felt a small warm hand slip into his own.
He looked up to see Elio standing over him, no longer trembling. Naomi was there too, her face smudged with soot but her eyes burning with a fierce protective light. She grabbed a silk curtain from the window and began to tie a tourniquet around Salvatore's arm.
"The house is quiet," she whispered, her voice steady.
Salvatore looked at the maid who had saved him and the boy who had changed him. The silk of his reputation was gone, replaced by something much stronger. He squeezed Elio's hand. "The house isn't quiet, Naomi.
It's just finally ours."
The morning sun didn't just rise over the Moretti estate. It conquered it,
burning through the lingering silver mist until the gardens glowed with a vibrant, defiant green. Inside the great house, the air no longer carried the heavy metallic scent of gunpowder or the stifling weight of unspoken betrayals. The shattered glass had been cleared, the blood scrubbed from the marble, and the heavy oak doors stood wide open, inviting the fresh morning breeze to wander through the halls. In the grand dining room, the long mahogany table, once a place where men sat in terrifying silence to trade lives and territories, was set for three. Salvatore sat at the head, his arm resting in a clean white sling, his dark suit replaced by a soft linen shirt. He looked less like a king on a throne and more like a man who had finally put down a burden he'd been carrying for decades. Naomi moved with a graceful, unhurried ease, placing a platter of fresh fruit and golden brown pastries in the center of the table. She had traded her stiff maid's uniform for a simple dress the color of the sunrise, and the tension that had lived in her shoulders for years had finally vanished. As she poured the coffee, her hand brushed Salvatore's shoulder, not as a servant, but as an equal, a silent acknowledgement of the war they had survived together. Between them sat Elio. The boy was no longer a shadow or a ghost. He wore a clean sweater and sat tall in his chair, his chin level, just as Salvatore had taught him. He wasn't looking at his shoes. He was watching a pair of blue jays bicker on the terrace railing, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "The city is quiet today," Naomi remarked, her voice a warm melody that filled the high-vaulted room. Salvatore looked at her, then at the boy who was now reaching for a piece of toast with steady hands. "The city is learning a new name," Salvatore replied, his voice a low, contented velvet. "The old world ended last night. We're starting a different one." He reached out his good hand, resting it on the table. Elio didn't flinch. Instead, the boy placed his small hand over Salvatore's scarred knuckles, anchoring them both to the present. There were still debts to be settled and a name to be protected, but for the first time in his life, Salvatore didn't see his estate as a fortress or a tomb. As the light flooded the room, turning the silver tea service into a shimmering mirror, the three of them sat together in the warmth. The silk was gone, and the ghost had found a home. They ate in a silence that wasn't born of fear, but of peace, the kind of peace that only comes when the storm has finally run out of rain.